Welcome to Concept Collection. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. Inflation. Certainly been the word on everyone's minds lately, and for good reason. We've all seen those price tags climb higher at the grocery store, felt the pinch at the pump, and maybe even reconsidered some of those bigger purchases that we had planned. Is this high inflation that we're experiencing in the U.S. just a temporary blip, or are we entering a new era of elevated prices? Today we'll delve into the data, examining those historical trends to see where we stand and perhaps glean some insights into what the future holds. So let's start with the current state of affairs. As of November 2024, the inflation rate sits at 2.7%. Now, that might sound relatively tame, especially when we compare it to that eye-popping 9.1% peak that we saw back in June 2022. But before we breathe a sigh of relief, consider this. The Federal Reserve aims for an inflation rate that's closer to 2%. And perhaps even more importantly, the cumulative effect of inflation since the pandemic began in early 2020 is a staggering 22.1%. Think about that for a second. What you could have bought for $1,000 in 2020 now costs a pull of under $21. That's a significant erosion of purchasing power, and it's something we all feel in our daily lives. It's tempting to look back at the pre-pandemic years, say 2017 to 2019, with a sense of nostalgia. Many recall this as a time of economic strength, and indeed inflation during that period hovered around that desirable 2% mark. It was a period of relative price stability, so much so that most people barely noticed inflation in their everyday lives. But the world changed dramatically with the arrival of the pandemic. Unprecedented disruptions to supply chains and then labor shortages and a surge in demand fueled that rapid escalation in prices, culminating in that 40-year high inflation rate in 2022. Fast forward to today, and while some of those pandemic-related pressures have eased, inflation persists, driven by a different set of factors. What are the biggest culprits? Housing. Shelter costs, which include rent and equivalent rent for homeowners, are contributing almost 2/3 of the current inflationary pressure. We are finally seeing some moderation in rent increases, which offers a glimmer of hope, but housing costs remain a major burden for many. Another pain point for consumers is the persistent increase in food prices. While the rate of increase has cooled compared to the peak in 2022, food prices are still 1.6% higher than a year ago. This means grocery bills continue to strain household budgets. Then there's the transportation sector. This includes both transportation services and motor vehicle insurance, both of which have seen substantial price increases. And let's face it, for many Americans, owning a car isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. So these rising costs hit particularly hard. Now let's talk about wages. In the pre-pandemic years, wages were generally outpacing inflation. This meant that for many workers, paychecks were stretching a bit further, and they were experiencing a real increase in their purchasing power. Unfortunately, the post-pandemic reality has been a different story. For a time, wages lagged behind that rapid rise in prices, leaving many feeling like they were falling behind financially. The good news is that we've recently seen wage growth surpass inflation once again. However, this is a trend that warrants close attention as we move forward. Despite facing these economic headwinds, the U.S. economy has managed to avoid a recession so far. This is notable considering the Federal Reserve's series of interest rate hikes, a measure designed to cool down the economy and curb inflation. But these high interest rates come with a trade-off. They make borrowing more expensive for consumers. This means that mortgages, auto loans, and other forms of credit become more costly, impacting everything from buying a home to managing existing debt. And it raises an important question. Will these higher interest rates be enough to truly tame inflation? Before we delve further into that question, let's take a step back and consider how we measure inflation in the first place. You've likely heard of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which is what we've been discussing so far. But the Federal Reserve actually favors a different measure called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, or PCE. Both indices track price changes, but they include different baskets of goods and services, leading to some variations in their readings. The Fed believes the PCE provides a more comprehensive and nuanced picture of inflation, which is why they rely on it for making policy decisions. So are we simply experiencing a temporary surge in prices? Or are we adjusting to a new normal of persistently higher inflation? To answer this question, it's helpful to look back at historical periods of high inflation in the United States, and one era that stands out is the 1970s. The 1970s, much like today, were marked by this confluence of factors that led to a prolonged period of high inflation. One of the most significant events was the oil crisis of 1973, when OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, imposed an oil embargo on the U.S., and this sent oil prices soaring, creating this ripple effect throughout the global economy. We've certainly seen echoes of this in recent times with the energy price volatility. But the 1970s also offer a cautionary tale about the role of government policy in managing inflation. At the time, policymakers attempted to address rising prices by increasing government spending and expanding the money supply. However, these actions, some economists argue, ultimately exacerbated the problem. Instead of cooling down inflation, they contributed to what's known as a wage price spiral. As prices climbed, workers demanded higher wages to keep pace with the rising cost of living. In turn, businesses raised prices further to cover those increased labor costs. This created a vicious cycle where wages and prices chased each other upward, pushing inflation even higher. We're witnessing a similar dynamic today with rising wages and some businesses passing those costs on to consumers in the form of higher prices. The experience of the 1970s underscores the complexity of inflation and the potential unintended consequences of certain policy responses. It took decisive action, including significant interest rate hikes by the Federal Reserve under then-Chairman Paul Volcker to finally bring inflation under control. So are we destined to repeat the mistakes of the past, or have we learned from history and are better equipped to navigate this current inflationary environment? The answer, unfortunately, is not so simple. There are a number of key differences between the economic landscape of the 1970s and today that could influence how things unfold. One notable difference is the role of the Federal Reserve. Today, the Fed operates with a greater degree of independence than it did in the 1970s. Its dual mandate is to maintain price stability, meaning keeping inflation in check, and to promote maximum employment. In recent decades, the Fed has largely succeeded in keeping inflation low and stable, fostering a more predictable economic environment. However, this current bout of inflation has put the Fed's credibility to the test. Another key distinction is the impact of globalization. We live in a far more interconnected world than we did in the 1970s. This means that global events, from pandemics to geopolitical conflicts, can have profound effects on the U.S. economy, including on inflation. The COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, caused significant disruptions to global supply chains, contributing to rising prices. And the war in Ukraine has further exacerbated inflationary pressures, particularly in energy markets. Finally, we can't overlook the role of demographics. The U.S. population is aging, leading to a slowdown in population growth. This could have a dampening effect on economic growth and potentially on inflation as well. So what does all of this mean for you? What can you take away from this complex interplay of historical trends, economic forces, and policy decisions? The reality is that inflation is a multifaceted issue, and predicting its future trajectory with certainty is impossible. What we can say with confidence is that it's crucial to stay informed and to consider how these trends might impact your personal financial decisions. We've seen inflation cool from its peak, but the question remains, are we simply returning to the relative stability of the pre-pandemic era, or are we adapting to a new economic landscape where those higher prices are a more permanent fixture? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while I don't have a crystal ball, understanding the forces at play, both from a historical and current perspective, can help us make more informed choices about our spending, our saving, and our investing habits. The economic landscape is constantly evolving, and inflation, like many economic phenomena, is a bit of a moving target. What's important is that we remain vigilant, adaptable, and perhaps most importantly, informed, because ultimately understanding the dynamics of inflation empowers us to make sound financial decisions in this ever-changing world. Thanks for watching Concept Collection. Now check out my next video below.